On the 15th of April 1989, the worst sporting disaster in the history of the United Kingdom took place at the Hillsborough Football Stadium. At a football match between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, a number of Liverpool fans were permitted to enter the stadium through an exit gate. This was to escape a potential crush at an overcrowded turnstile, but it instead resulted in massive overcrowding inside the stadium. As more and more people entered through the gate, fans were crushed against the steel fences, suffocating as bodies pressed against one another. In total, 97 men, women and children were crushed to death and over 700 people were injured, many left with life-altering conditions and psychological trauma. Whilst the event is distressing enough, a series of cover-ups as to the cause of the crush, as well as the spreading of lies about the conduct of the Liverpool fans by the police and media, truly added to the distress of the survivors and their victims' families. In today's video, we will cover the events that led up to the Hillsborough disaster, the failures that caused the crush, and the fight to uncover the truth of what happened. It is perhaps helpful to understand the situation at the Hillsborough Football Stadium. It was to be the site for the FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, the FA Cup being a major competition in English football. Hillsborough Stadium was the grounds for the football team Sheffield Wednesday, and so it was a neutral site for both sets of fans to attend. It accommodated for both sitting and standing room for fans. As was normal for football grounds at the time, Hillsborough was divided into pens by high metal fences that corralled fans into blocks and separated them from the pitch. A police presence at football matches was required as to direct where fans were allowed to go to ensure the stadiums were not overcrowded and to deal with potential football hooliganism, which was a major problem in the 1980s. The match had completely sold out, which would mean some 53,000 people would be entering the stadium on the day of the disaster. Most of this number were Liverpool fans, yet they were given the smaller end of the stadium and an entrance by turnstile on Leppings Lane. The match was due to start at 3 PM. As Liverpool fans began arriving at Leppings Lane at around midday, there were not enough open turnstiles to let people through quickly. With only 7 open to deal with thousands of people, once through the turnstiles, the vast majority of fans would make their way down a wide tunnel leading to the standing area pens. The tunnel was long, narrow and dark with a floor that sloped upwards. Upon exiting the tunnel, one was greeted immediately with the pens 3 and 4 and the fence that divided them. Access to other pens designated 1 and 2 were not all that clearly signposted. For example, a sign for refreshments was much bigger than the one showing the way to those pens. This resulted in an uneven distribution of fans between the pens. By 2:15, a crowd had built up outside the Leppings Lane, and by 2:30, only 4,400 of the 10,000 fans had entered, leaving some 5,600 fans still to enter. Despite many people discussing the possibility of delaying the start of the game, it was decided that this would not be possible. By 2:45, there were still thousands of fans trying to get through the turnstiles, but many were pressed up against the exit gate, designated as Gate C. The funnel-shaped area around the 3 main exit gates caused congestion that was hard for people to escape. The turnstiles became jammed as the risk of a crush became apparent. In a bid to alleviate the situation, exit gate C was opened around 10 minutes before the game was to start. The order to open the gate was made by Superintendent David Duckenfield, the South Yorkshire police officer in overall command.
With the gate open, around 2,000 people were able to get into the grounds. Instead of the steady trickle of fans entering the stadium through the 7 turnstiles, a massive influx of people flooded the tunnel, the vast majority ending up in the pens designated 3 and 4. Each of these pens were separated by high fences that divided the pens and had an overhanging fence, both of which were designed to contain violent hooligans. The official capacity of central pens was listed at 2,200, but this figure was incorrect. It was based on previous assessments where there were no dividing fences, meaning the actual capacity was around 1,600. At no point did stewards or police enter the tunnel to direct fans away from the already full pens 3 and 4 to the pens 1 and 2, which still had space. By kickoff at 3 o'clock, an estimated 3,000 people were squeezed into pens. With so many people in the pens, the excitement of the match faded as people began to feel squashed. The first signs something was amiss would be as minor as people standing on one another's feet, finding little space to move, and it grew more and more uncomfortable. The pressure continued to rise as the crush began. Those at the front were trapped between the weight of ever more bodies and the overhanging fence. Bodies went numb as the crush rendered fans immobile. As fans screamed in pain and shouted for help, some photographers turned from the game to the chaos in the pens. Accounts from those there recall hearing someone screaming out in agony, often followed by their abrupt silence. Eventually, one of the barriers in Pen 3 gave way, resulting in people falling over one another. Some fans were able to escape through small holes that were made in the fence, or were lifted into the stands above, some even escaping over the fence with help from those who had already made it out. But many were crushed, suffering from compression, asphyxiation, and massive trauma to their bodies. It was not until 5 minutes into the game that Superintendent Greenwood ran onto the pitch to tell the referee to stop the game. Some supporters used adverts that bordered the pitch to create improvised stretchers, and many attempted to give first aid to the injured if possible. However, the police and ambulance service delayed in declaring the event a major incident, which led to delays in medical assistance arriving. When it did, breakdowns in communication resulted in most of the ambulances not entering the pitch, with the injured and dying having to be brought out to them. Of the 97 people who died as a result of the Hillsborough disaster, most died standing up of traumatic asphyxiation. Others spent their last moments on advertising boards as their fellow Liverpool fans attempted to revive them, or carry them towards ambulances that remained outside. Some were even killed after losing their footing in the pen and being trampled by others with nowhere to go. One fan died the next day in hospital, whilst another, named Anthony Bland, died in 1993. The case of Bland is a landmark case for those interested in the legal side of things. Anthony was left in a persistent vegetative state, with machines keeping him alive. His family had to fight in the courts for the right to withdraw the treatment, thus ending his life, which set a legal precedent. The 97th victim, Andrew Devine, suffered with life-changing injuries, and was added to the memorial on his passing in 2021.
Almost immediately, attempts were made to pin the blame for the crush on Liverpool fans, those who died, who were injured and traumatised. Duckenfield initially lied, stating that Liverpool fans had opened the gate and forced their way through the stadium. Duckenfield would later be forced to admit, whilst he gave the order to open the gate, he gave no thought as to where the fans would go. Duckenfield was new to his position and had limited experience of policing football matches. In fact, he had not policed Hillsborough in any capacity in the last 10 years prior to him assuming responsibility over the 54,000 lives who would attend. Duckenfield had replaced Chief Superintendent Brian Mole, who had presided over many matches at Hillsborough. The replacement occurred just 21 days before their semi-final, but it was not clear even to this day as to why this change occurred. Prior to the match, a briefing was held that did stress the importance of crowd safety, but many more meetings stressed the importance of crowd control. These meetings emphasised the expectation of ticketless fans and drunken behaviour. The focus of policing approach for the match was to be on crowd control rather than crowd safety. Duckenfield did not order any officers to close the tunnel to the already full pens 3 and 4, nor did he divert fans to the other pens that were still unfilled. A lot of emphasis was initially put on the fact that most of the Liverpool fans were attempting to enter the grounds had no ticket, but no cordon was put in place to filter out the ticketless fans. Footage from the event shows countless Liverpool fans waving their tickets into the cameras as proof that this was not the case. Finally, much emphasis was placed on painting Liverpool fans as unruly drunks. At the site where their bodies were kept, families would have the ordeal of identifying their loved ones, quickly followed up by questions as to how much alcohol the deceased had drunk. Police photographers were dispatched to record pictures of the litter, notably evidence of empty beer cans as proof the Liverpool fans were too drunk and therefore the ones to blame. Alcohol blood levels were tested on the deceased, which emphasised that some fans were so drunk that they were not able to legally drive. But it is important to point out, however, that the levels of alcohol found in the blood was no different to what can be expected of people at any social event. Rumours were spread by the police officers as to the drunken conduct of the Liverpool fans. Most infamously, the Sun newspaper, a tabloid, ran a story with the headline "The Truth." It printed unfounded and untrue stories of Liverpool fans stealing from the dead, from stopping life-saving treatment, and even committing SA on an unconscious woman. The police control room logbook for April 15th, 1989 began at 8 AM, but there was no entry beyond 2:21 PM. Duckenfield was unable to explain how he spent 2 hours before arriving in the control room box at 2 PM. As a point of contrast, his predecessor, Superintendent Brian Mole, would spend his time driving around potential trouble spots in the city and patrolling the stadium, keeping open communication with his officers as to how the situation on the ground was proceeding. The control box, which directly looks over the Lepping Lane end and offered a clear view of the crush, was where Duckenfield would remain throughout the disaster. It is important to note that this was not an unforeseen event. There was precedent for crushes at Hillsborough. In 1981, the FA Semi-Cup final between Tottenham and Wolverhampton, there was a serious congestion at the Leppings Lane turnstiles, much like what occurred in 1989. Again, Exit Gate C was opened in a bid to alleviate the congestion, but a crush ensued. Thankfully, there were no fatalities, but many were badly injured, narrowly escaping death due to the fact there were no high fences to divide the pens. After this, Hillsborough was not used for FA Cup matches until 1987, and fences were put into place to separate the area into pens. But there was no change by Sheffield Wednesday Football Club as to the maximum capacity for these newly created pens, nor were there any real considerations as to the adequacy of the safety procedures put in place. These changes to the stadium rendered the health and safety certificate null and void, but the certificate was never renewed. Ultimately, the improvement to the security procedures designed to keep rival fans apart meant there was little to no hope of escaping the crush and proved fatal. In August of 1989, Lord Justice Taylor produced the first of many official reports into the disaster. It categorically laid the blame for the tragedy at the police for their poor handling and organisation of the football match. It also pointed out that South Yorkshire's police were wrong to blame the Liverpool fans instead of accepting their faults. In October of 1990, the police disciplinary action started against Duckenfield. As a result, he retired on medical grounds, diagnosed with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. In doing so, he remained eligible for full pension. Whilst the South Yorkshire Police accepted civil liability and conceded they had acted negligently, the inquest in 1991 ruled the deaths as accidental. Subsequent attempts to raise further inquests and investigations by the survivors and the families of the victims continued for many years. It was not until 1997 that further information came to light. The new Labour government ordered a review into the matter. It was discovered that the South Yorkshire Police had altered 164 officers' accounts of their recollection of the day before sending them to the first inquiry. This includes all references to whether the tunnel leading to pens 3 and 4 should have been closed, as had been done before in such matches. However, nothing further was done under the assertion that there was not enough new evidence for an inquiry. The Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, had even written his thoughts on the note regarding a new inquiry. Simply put, why? What is the point? Further attempts at private legal actions brought against the likes of Duckenfield proved to be fruitless. Despite continued pressure from families and survivors, it was not until 2009 that Andy Burnham, then Culture Secretary, and Maria Eagle, Minister of State for Justice, pushed for an inquiry some 20 years after the event. The Hillsborough Independent Panel set about reviewing some 450,000 documents from various sources. Amongst them were previously secret documents that were made public. In September of 2012, the panel produced a report, the link to which will be available in the description. It catalogued the events and laid bare the massive shortcomings of the South Yorkshire Police, Sheffield Wednesday Football Club, and categorically set the record straight as to the conduct of the Liverpool fans. In response to the report, then Prime Minister Theresa May ordered a criminal investigation. The initial inquest from 1991 was deemed to have been improperly conducted and so quashed, with a new inquest set up in 2014. 2 years later, an inquest with a jury of 9 people answered 14 key questions about the disaster, which will be linked in the description. The inquiry found defects in the construction and layout of the stadium contributed to the disaster. No behaviour on part of Liverpool fans contributed to the dangerous situation at the Leppings Lane turnstiles. And crucially, those who died in the disaster were unlawfully killed. After 27 years of campaigning in the face of lies and indifference from those in positions of power, the truth was finally made clear to all. In 2012, the Sun newspaper published an apology for their earlier false claims, though for many in Liverpool to this day, the Sun newspaper is still boycotted. In 2019, Duckenfield was charged with gross negligence manslaughter. His defence raised the notion that disaster would be inevitable, that the Liverpool fans' behaviour was to blame, and the bad planning of the stadium design. Duckenfield was acquitted, and despite the inquest in 2016 ruling the killings as unlawful, no individual or organisation has been held criminally liable for the deaths. The Hillsborough disaster is truly a tragic tale. It is a tale of police cover-ups, of media lies, and of governments unwilling to investigate the truth behind the falsehoods. Massive health and safety errors and omissions resulted in a stadium that had the potential to be a death trap. Whilst the high-ranking members of the South Yorkshire Police were able to employ the sufficient crowd control to avoid fatalities, Duckenfield's lack of preparation, experience, and foresight resulted in Exit Gate C opening with nowhere for the fans to go other than to cause the crush. It was finally made clear from the evidence that the safety of the fans was not a consideration. They were treated with contempt on the 15th of April 1989 as they were deemed a lower-class, violent rabble. It's hard not to think the same contempt was shown for over 2 decades, until the truth was finally made clear.